Oh, Jenny's just highlighting the fact that we are recording, and I think everybody should have received the joining instructions in regards to the kind of housekeeping. But if you have any issues, please just put something in the chat, both in terms of the structure or kind of if you're having any challenges, but also if you have any questions. But on that point, it'd be really nice if people can just introduce themselves in the chat, just a little bit about who you are and where you're from today. The title, obviously, for today's session is a really timely one. And if those of you who don't know, Nerif, we've been in existence, Gary, for how many years now? You're on mute.
About 10.
Yeah, I think it initially started as a partnership between the local universities across the Northeast, but it's extended to practitioners. We have a fabulous, and I keep saying, why am I saying fabulous? Sorry, it's one of those days. We have a really esteemed group of panel members today to share some up-to-date, relevant data and reports. I mean, I don't think there's anybody in this virtual space who isn't aware of some of the challenges that people from minority communities have had, not just since COVID, not just, kind of in the last couple of years. This has been an ongoing challenge and issue for many, many minoritized communities across the UK forever. And then every so often we make some progress and then fall back over. Literally in the last couple of weeks, we've had the death of 2 young boys at the age of 5 who were turned away from hospitals. We've had the report from London Fire Brigade, which highlights some serious challenges and issues. But when it comes to the issue of poverty and cost of living crisis, I think this just adds to the challenges that people across the Northeast are facing, but in particular, people from marginalised, minoritized communities. What I will do shortly is hand over to Gary to talk a little bit about Nerif, and then we will invite the first speaker. But if you have any questions, please ping them in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Shida. Yes, Nerif Northeast Race Equality Forum has been going for about 10 years, and we did start, first of all, with a collaboration between 3 universities on a report about racial justice in the region. The other universities then came on board, and we started disseminating some of our research findings through conferences, which became so popular that we then decided we would build some kind of forum. And over the years, we've settled somewhere around 300 organizations. We publish regular information briefings and research briefings. We've just put 2 new information briefings on the web, and I mean, these are open for anybody to write about issues relevant to the issue of ethnic and race relations in the region. And I'll ask Jenny just to remind if she wouldn't mind putting the website in the chat so that people can get that logged into their system and keep up to date. We also hold probably 3 yearly, meaning 3 times a year, webinars, seminars on key topics. And this is the latest of the series. And each time we have one, we renew our request for people. If they have ideas about other webinars they'd like to have, then we'd be very keen to hear. One of the recent ones we did, for example, was about the experience of young Black kids in education in the region. So if you've got the website on the chat at some stage, you can follow that up. Any more information that's not on the website that you need, you can either contact Jenny or myself. My details are on the website too. I'm a visiting professor at Newcastle University, although given the circumstances of lots of COVID and not many trains, I haven't been visiting very much in the recent past. Just 2 minutes kind of scene setting, and much of this may well be familiar, and it will be built on and updated by our keynote speakers. And I'd just like to add my thanks to all of them for giving their time for this, because it's incredibly valuable. And one of the benefits, I suppose, of COVID, if you could call it that, is that we, like many organizations, have turned very much more to Zoom. And in a way that makes it easier for people to access events of this kind rather than travel a long way and take a lot of time to do it. We know obviously a lot now about the history of ethnic minority migration to the UK. Of course, it didn't start with Windrush. I have a spot about 200 yards from where I live, where an archaeological team dug up a group of Black women's skeletons, which were dated at about 600 AD. The feeling is they were probably associated with the Roman invasion several centuries before. But there is a theory too circulating that at one point York was actually a majority Black city. Would have been very small, but it does go back a long way. Of course, most of the migrants came into low-paid jobs on the buses, on the trains, in the woolen mills, in the cotton mills, in the dirty, dangerous and difficult parts of industries. And of course, the legacy of poverty from that initial wave of migration has remained with ethnic minorities. And despite some rather half-hearted attempts by government to address the issue of ethnicity and poverty, there hasn't been a great deal of change relative to the population of the whole. We have seen that some minorities, particularly those of Bangladeshi and Pakistani origin, remain bottom of the heap in terms of poverty. Some groups have done a bit better. We know that the best achieving group of young people leaving school are girls of Indian and Chinese origin. But throughout the whole of the period, since the Second World War, we've seen a very clear picture. There are, as I say, stark differences in poverty rates according to ethnic group. And there hasn't been, in relative terms, much change over the last 20 or 30 years. And this, as I say, is the area that we're going to be looking at with one emphasis, of course, on child poverty, as you'll see from our speakers. So there's been a lot more research in recent years. And if people are interested, I'll put my email address on the chat too, so that people can contact me and I can point you towards some of the key reports, particularly by people like Lucinda Platt, who's now at the London School of Economics, and immodestly I say also myself, but in recent years, very, very substantially from the Runnymede Trust. And that gives me a nice segue into introducing our first speaker, Matthew Johnson from the Runnymede Trust. We noticed a couple of months ago, I think it was, Matthew, the new report that's been published by Runnymede, and that gave me an opportunity to pester Runnymede once again to ask for them to come and share some of their insights. So over to you, Matthew.
Thank you. I'll just get ready to share my screen. Hopefully I can figure out all some of the technical issues. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. Everyone, can you all see my screen there? Is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. No, thank you for having me. It's a privilege to deliver this presentation today. I've not long arrived back in the country. I was in Zimbabwe for about a month, not long lasted, so still a little bit jet lagged. So bear with me throughout this presentation today, but it is a privilege to be with you to discuss about race, poverty and inequality in the Northeast. So my name is Matt Johnson. I'm a senior researcher based at the Runnymede Trust. For those who do not know about the Runnymede Trust, it's the Runnymede Trust is a leading race equality think tank based in London, but does analysis across the UK, nationally and regionally, looking at areas such as education, health, and a range of social metrics there. So within this presentation, I'm going to talk around a few areas. So I'm going to start with some of the demographic trends and changes, given the recent census that came out this week, just to set the scene there. And then a bit of a discussion around the education landscape, and then bringing it a bit more down to the local level and looking at labour market participation within the Northeast, patterns of home ownership, wealth inequality. I won't speak too much around child poverty because I know there's a presentation coming later around child poverty, but I'll just spend a few seconds discussing that, and then finally just around the cost of living as well there. So yeah, so in terms of the demographic trends and changes, I mean, as you know, the UK. So just move some of this. The UK is actually becoming a rapidly more ethnically diverse within the past few decades, and the recent census has further highlighted the kind of pace of ethnic diversity that we've seen in this country. And while migration flows are, of course, a crucial part of the study, it's not only about migration. So natural growth also drives the current trend towards greater ethnic diversity that we're seeing within the UK. Well, actually, diversity is something that should not be just spoken of, that happens between groups. Actually, there's a significant amount of diversity within groups, and actually, we do welcome the recent census that actually broke down some of that diversity and looked at some of the ethnic differences within populations, something that we have been calling for quite a long time, essentially, that the nuances within ethnic groups is something to consider. So, for example, when we take the Black African ethnic group, many of these are kind of many Black African ethnic groups are from first-generation immigrants, and then you have a lot of Windrush generation Black Caribbean individuals who were born in the UK and will have grandparents and who perhaps come here from the 1950s. And when we look at the data, to kind of lump everybody kind of together within the statistics can sometimes provide an incomplete picture when we do not actually look forensically and some of the nuances within some of the within ethnic groups as well. So just wanted to make that point about the richness of the diversity within ethnic groups as well. And the ethnic minority population is something that it's much younger than the population as a whole, and most ethnic groups are disproportionately concentrated in cities. I think our last count, about 58% of the Black population were based in London. So yeah, so those are some of the trends and changes with across kind of ethnic minority populations as well. So let's talk about the education landscape. So there are actually been some positive and trends within the education landscape. So we are seeing, as I think Gary mentioned before, some rapid improvements within educational outcomes for actually many students from minority ethnic groups. So, for example, in England, the GCSE attainment rate, particularly amongst sort of Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Black African students, it's actually improved within the past 2 decades. And when we compare Bangladeshi students from, say, 2004 to 2019, there was about 9% attainment gap with white British students compared to a 6 percentage point advantage actually in 2019. Still, a lot of persistent inequalities and difficulties within education. So school exclusion rates, particularly within the Black Caribbean community, quite worrying statistics. Also, national, quite worrying nationally, and also regionally within the Northeast, with the disparities when we look at school exclusions. And school exclusions are much more likely to lead the school to prison pipeline, whereby students are excluded, they're more likely to enter into poverty or into the criminal justice system as well. So in terms of the higher education landscape, students from almost all minority ethnic groups are actually more likely to attend university today than their kind of white counterparts. However, there are still significant persistent attainment gaps that do exist for students once they are at university as well. And once students are actually at university, there's also a gap in outcomes and labor market outcomes. So yeah, higher than so positive trends in terms of actual access to education at the secondary level, some gains, some positive trends there. But then we have to look at the whole kind of pipeline, and we do see some leakages there. So let's look a bit more forensically in terms of the Northeast. Actually, this morning I just crunched a few numbers and thought I'd just look at labor market participation a bit in the Northeast. So what I found, according to the latest data, so we're seeing essentially a gap between the England average and the Northeast across almost every ethnic group. So there is that disparity. I mean, across most ethnic groups, there is a disparity between the England average in terms of labor market participation. But as you can see, according to the latest data, so this kind of purple graph here shows the current employment rate within the Northeast, and this 5.6 shows the gap essentially to the England average. So the gap here is obviously more stark for some groups more than others. So you have the mixed ethnic group was about a minus 15.8 gap there. When we look at the Black or Black British, there's a 8.6 gap there as well. But even though there is this sort of gap between England and the Northeast, you still have about 71% employment, say, for the white British community in the Northeast, but then you have, you know, around about, 47% for the mixed ethnicities, 55%, about 56% for the Black British. So what you can see is sort of wide disparities and gaps to the England average within the Northeast as well. So as I said before, even though you may have gains within the education space, in some ways, and higher entrance within the higher education space and the secondary education space as well. You know, what in terms of poverty and outcomes, you know, labor market participation, you know, is a big one essentially. But we're still seeing some persistent disadvantages there, particularly in the Northeast, with some of the gaps to the England average. And then, so beyond actual employment, there's also the issue of wealth as well, and home ownership is a key issue in terms of wealth. So across all regions of the UK, there are gaps, you know, quite significant gaps between home ownership and between the white British ethnic group and other than white British ethnic groups. Within the Northeast, it's about a 12% gap, which is actually a smaller gap than many other regions, but some of that may be due to sort of lower so the cost of housing being lower than say some other parts of the UK, but still quite a significant gap in home ownership nonetheless there. That of course can lead to a lack of wealth as well. In terms of wealth, some research that we recently done from our Colour of Money report reported that so in this graph shows that while Indian households have about 90 to 95p for every £1 of British wealth, Pakistanis household have about 50p, Black Caribbean households have around 20 pence, and Black African and Bangladeshi approximately 10 pence. So again, significant racial inequalities when we're looking at not only just employment and education, but overall wealth as well, that incorporate things such as pensions and savings and home ownership. Significant sort of disparities in terms of wealth inequality there. Now, I won't speak too much around child poverty because there's no, Amanda's going to speak a bit more about that in detail. But as you may know, the trajectory is that there is a bit of there is quite a child poverty crisis in the Northeast, whereby it is higher than London, again. But you will get more detail about that coming later. So I'll rein back on some of this as well. And then this just breaks down some of the local authority, this at the local authority level. Again, I'll save some of my notes for that part because I know further discussions coming into there. But what I will highlight is that while child poverty within the Northeast is, you know, something that will impact people of all whichever of all different ethnic groups, given the gaps between the England and the England average and the Northeast in terms of employment and different forms of outcomes, the likelihood to be in child poverty is increased if you're from a Black or minority ethnic group. So 21% of all children in a household headed by someone from a Black or minority ethnic group, for children living, you know, that the 21% of all children that they are living in poverty, and the figures about 29% before housing costs and 31% after housing costs as well. And these trends are particularly marked for children from households that are headed from sort of British Pakistani, Bangladeshi or Black background. Fortunately, within trying to find some regional breakdown of the child poverty figures, but as you know, I mean, the Northeast is actually one of the least ethnically diverse regions of the UK, even though the census shows us that this diversity, you know, is increasing in the Northeast. But it's likely that the proportion of children living in poverty who come from ethnic groups other than the white population will be smaller than across the UK. But those from a Black or minority ethnic group tend to be based in poverty. So finally, I will just kind of mention the cost of living report that was mentioned by Gary at the beginning. I've got a Falling Faster report that shows that actually the proportion of the population falling more than 60% below median incomes, that definition of being in poverty. So again, quite a wide disparity when we look at the proportion falling in this sort of deeper aspect of poverty, with, you know, about 51% of Bangladeshi households fall, you know, in this threshold, and 46% of Pakistani Black. And then, yeah, you can see the disparity there. And while the cost of living crisis affects, you know, everyone feels the pinch of everyone's feeling the pinch of the cost of living crisis, there are some communities that are actually falling faster, that are feeling the pinch a bit harder than others as well. So in real terms, as I say, white families now receive £454 less a year on average in cash benefits than they did a decade ago. So yeah, real drop in living standards for everyone, including white families as well. But this does actually worsen to about £806 less a year for Black and minority ethnic families, and a staggering £1,635 for Black families as well. And Black and minority ethnic women have been actually some of the worst affected people in this regards. And when you compare to a decade ago, £1,040 less in cash benefits than they did a decade ago. And and when we talk about the cost of living crisis, these developments have of course left Black and minority households disproportionately exposed to the cost of living crisis. So essentially, what we're seeing is that, you know, there's a story whereby, as we know, due to the cost of living crisis, everyone is sort of feeling the pinch. There's been there have been some gains in areas of education, and there's been, but there are still wide disparities in terms of the impacts of some of the macroeconomic effects and the cost of living crisis that's felt across the country, which has resulted in some groups falling faster. I'll leave it there to just invite any thoughts and questions, and I'll stop sharing.
Right, thank you very much, Matthew. Is it reasonable to assume that we can have copies of your slides which we could post on our website? Because obviously there's a huge amount of information there which would have been difficult to keep up to date with in terms of writing it down. But would you be happy for us to have those slides with an appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine. That's fine for me.
Right. The other general point, I mean, we plan to leave a reasonable amount of time at the end of the session for questions and answers. Perhaps people might be gathering together bits from different presentations. So if we can concentrate now on what might be called minor issues, if there are such things.
Luckily, one I don't have to do.
In this territory. I just wanted to make one point, I suppose. It's not really a question, but you may have an observation on it. Yes, the Northeast is less ethnically diverse and has been ever since measures were put in place through the census to establish how diverse the region is. But I think I'd make the point that it is a region which is, how shall I put it, oversubscribed in terms of refugees. Of course, the asylum seekers wouldn't be registered in the census because they don't have citizenship, but there is a very significant number of refugees who we know from other data and other research are much more prone to be in poverty. We have a dispersal area in Newcastle, we have a dispersal area in Middlesbrough, and although I don't think Sunderland is a formal dispersal area, certainly a very substantial number of asylum seekers and refugees have been dispersed both to Sunderland and to other parts of the region. So I think there's a bit of undercounting going here, if you like, and this may be something that other speakers might pick up. I know from my own experience in York that ethnic minorities as a whole have been undercounted, and I'm sure this is as true in the Northeast as it is in York, and in the Northeast, in York, it's due to at least three factors. Non-response. The census in 2011 said there were 370 Bangladeshis in York. I found through some qualitative research accounts of a huge funeral in Newcastle, as it happens, to which York alone sent 350 Bangladeshis. So I don't suppose for a moment that was the whole of the Bangladeshi population. So I estimated that the Bangladeshi population from other figures was probably twice as high as the census reported. The Roma Gypsy traveller population is always undercounted. The official figure from the census for Roma Gypsy traveller was 350. We know from the work of the Travellers Trust here in York that there are at least 1,000, and that was 10 years ago. And we also know, because York has been the centre of a very large influx of migrant workers who tended not to be recorded in the census as much as they should be, that there were probably a couple of thousand migrant workers in and around the city who had not been recorded. This meant that I shifted the official census estimate of 9.3%, this is 2011, up to 12%. And I'm doing the same now for the 2029 census. So sorry, that's a rather large intervention, but I think I'm just making the point that yes, we may be less ethnically diverse, but we're perhaps not quite as low on numbers as the census might suggest. Anyway, sorry about this, it's very rude, but any quick questions that people would like to throw at Matthew before we go on to the next section?
Nitin's got his hand up.
Has he? Oh yes, right over there. Sorry, Nitin, you're right in the top left-hand corner.
That's all right. That's all right, Gary. I just really want to pick up on your point, Gary, particularly around demographics and really the importance of what you've presented. Matt, I appreciate is the data that you have, but with the census data that we've just got, it just shows that our communities are much more diverse. And in terms of ethnicity, and I'd be really interested down the line to see the impact of whether it's poverty, cost of living, and all the kind of things we've been talking about, how it impacts other groups that were not represented in your presentation. So, for example, we'll have children, from Arabic backgrounds, a whole range. As I say, our communities are becoming much more diverse, and I'd be really interested in understanding what the real impact is upon our growing communities, because what we've what we received in your presentation, which was really, really interesting, were the communities that we've known about for a long time. But I'm thinking more of the ones that have, you know, become part of our communities more recent, but will be part of the census data. So I guess the information will be there, but also understanding what impact all of this is having on those communities. On the smaller groups, if you like. Yeah, just a couple of observations before Matthew comes back, if he wants to add a comment. One is that there's been an Arab origin population on Tyneside since the 1920s, at least, as a result of their involvement in merchant shipping. The other is that going back to York, and again, I suspect this may be true in many parts of the Northeast. If I looked at all the 20 wards in York and the 3 largest minority groups in each of those 20 wards, not one of them was Pakistani, Indian, or Bangladeshi. 1 or 2 were Chinese. So if you like, the traditional large ethnic minority groups that we've grown used to talking about were not actually represented as the largest groups in any of the populations in York. They were all of other ethnic origins. But Matthew, did you want to just chuck something in there?
No, I'm glad this has come up actually, because something that we were calling for quite significantly is, I say, greater nuance in how the data is essentially represented. And you are kind of somewhat limited to the available data that you have, and we do currently kind of categorize across some the kind of broad categories. What came out in the census did actually provide a lot more nuance, a lot more breakdown, that looked at the Roma community, that looked at the Arab community, that so you did have those breakdowns there, but that available data that have just come out on, was it Tuesday, Wednesday, was around population. There's further data that's coming out that looks at labor, that looks at education. That's still to come out, I think, that around in January. So as soon as that data comes out, definitely going to crunch the numbers and see what that brings. But yeah, kind of limited to what the data that we have. But yeah, I genuinely, we have been calling for this greater nuance, but it's good to see that this is sort of moving in the right direction from the ONS. Right, thank you very much. Any other hands? I have to keep flipping screens in case I'm missing somebody. Any other quick comments, questions, or save them for the end? We're just about on time. Okay, right. Well, in that case, I'll move on to our next speaker. Thank you very much, Matthew. And no doubt people will have some other things to interrogate you about later on. We're going to hear from a group called Journey to Justice. I think there are 3 of you here, Abby, Carrie, and Mark. Is that right? Hope I've got you all right there. Who's opening up?
Carrie.
Carrie. Okay, over to you. Carrie, you've got 20 minutes if you need it. And same as before, we might have short questions afterwards, or we might save them for the end. Thank you very much for making the journey on your screen.
Okay, thank you, Gary, and thank you everybody for inviting us. It's great to be part of this meeting and to be back. Well, we've not lost connection with the Northeast. So yes, I'm going to start. My name's Carrie Supple. I'm going to start with a quick overview of Journey to Justice, and then Abby and Mark are going to say more about specific aspects of our work. Some of you might know us already because of our presence in the Northeast. We're a human rights education charity. With we look at universal human rights, but our focus has often been on racism and poverty. So those are key themes of our work. And many of us have been involved for years in anti-racist work and in education. So the picture you see in front of you is from, again, an event that many of you will know about in the late 50s in Little Rock in Arkansas. And in 2012, I was there at the museum, which tells the story of what happened at Little Rock, which is that 9 African-American students were chosen to challenge the continued segregation of schools, which had been deemed illegal by the Supreme Court. And they needed 16,000 students to protect them from the local white racists who tried to prevent them from going to school. When I visited the museum, which tells that story, there were recordings of people involved in the Little Rock 9 as they came to be known. And one of the voices I heard was of a parent of one of the 9. She talked about the experience they had, and they took such risks, all of them. They risked their homes and their jobs and their lives by being involved in challenging this segregation. And her courage just blew me away. I didn't know her name. She wasn't alive by the time I heard that recording. And that was when the seed of Journey to Justice was born. The courage she showed, the fact I'd not heard of her, made me really want to tell stories like hers of so-called ordinary people who did extraordinary things. So when I came back to England in 2013, I found a lot of people I'd been working with for years in education who were also interested in the idea of creating an organization that would tell those stories. So we set up Journey to Justice in the October of 2013. Our mission was and is to galvanize people to take action for social justice. And the action can be by many means. And you can see here, I won't read them out, but I'll give you a second to look at our vision, mission, and aims, which are still with us. And you can see all the details on our website, which we'll give you details of later. And we are all motivated by those particular words of Dr. Martin Luther King about the solidarity between peoples and how we're all affected by injustice to anyone affects all of us. That drives all of us. And the way we do this work is, if you picture a triangle, we combine teaching about history and these stories of courage with the role of the arts in social justice, how very important the arts always have been and still are, and also a dissection of how does change happen, what exactly has to happen for in non-violent ways for change to happen. Of course, there are stories upon stories, both in history and now, to help us analyze that. There are patterns that have helped achieve with the social justice and human rights wins that there have been. So that always drives our work, those 3 things. And so with solidarity at the heart and the repeated message that people like us can make change happen. It's not easy, doesn't always work, but we try and understand how that works when it does work. And the idea of voice, people having a voice through by whichever means. And there are hundreds of members of Journey to Justice throughout the country. We've never had staff or an office. It's one of those organizations that's quite organic and gathers strength wherever we go. And our first project was this traveling exhibition that tells stories of the civil rights movement, 6 so-called ordinary people from that US movement. So people involved in anti-poverty, in voter registration, in struggles for equality, whether through the Memphis sanitation workers strike of 1968, where Black workers went on strike after years of discrimination in every way. And that's where Martin Luther King came to speak to them, because of course he was involved in economic justice, campaigns for economic justice, and that's where he was murdered. He was in Memphis to support the sanitation workers. We tell the story of one of those strikers, and of young people involved in the march in Birmingham, Alabama for equality. And the picture you saw of Ruby Bridges on the school, the picture it resonates with the picture you saw of 5-year-old Ruby Bridges, who challenged segregation in the primary school in New Orleans. So the exhibition is also full of UK stories that link to those struggles, and of music. It's a multi-arts interactive exhibition, and it has traveled to 15 places in England since 2015. We launched it in Newcastle. We chose Newcastle because of the Northeast long history of struggles for social and economic justice. and because Dr. King was invited there in 1967 to receive the honorary degree. And I had been living in Newcastle for 10 years, so had a good start of organizations involved in anti-racist work and human rights work. So we were at Discovery Museum in April 2015. Our coordinator was Bethany Coyle, who's a musician locally. Then we went to Sheffield, which Mark will mention, and then we went to Middlesbrough in October 2016, and we were at Teesside University because our then chair Chandra was based there, and Sunderland in November of 2016 to the Sunderland Museum and Winter Gardens, and Rick Bowler was the main instigator. The local organizer was Lindsay Mullen, and a woman called Jackie Nixon chaired the local steering group, because I just want to tell you about the model we use wherever we go. The exhibition is a catalyst for activity, so it's not just a static exhibition. And we always work across the community with organizations interested in our work. Where we can get funding, or we have a volunteer, we have an organizer locally. The local people tell, they choose local stories to tell of so-called ordinary people's involvement in action for human rights. And many of the stories have been about racism and poverty and peace and LGBT rights and housing. They choose the local stories to add to our exhibition. And they organize events, films, walks, talks, teacher training, work with schools, that dance. We've worked with the Poverty Ends Now project at Children North East and so on. It's different in every place, and in every place we try and continue, and we've managed to continue staying in touch with the 3 areas in the Northeast where we've worked. So, for example, most recently we were back in Sunderland, and Claire Rogerson was one of our speakers at the launch of the film Abby's going to talk about. It was packed, it was fantastic, it was at Pop Rex. Rick helped us with that as well, and Steve Newman. And so wherever we can, we've stayed in touch. As I said, we're all volunteers, so it's not always easy, but in all these places we still have contacts and relationships. So Abby's showing you the Sunderland webpage. Each place we've been to has its own dedicated webpage, so you can see those details where you want. And I think we've got time to show a 1.5 minute clip from the film we made of our time in the Northeast. We'd just like you to see the first 1.5 minutes of that, so you get an idea, get a flavour of the Newcastle project. So over to you, Abby.
Get up, stand up for your rights. Freak out, don't give up the fight. Think of your future, what do you want to do?
It is very important, because without justice, there will be no peace.
Freedom, freedom, this
Freedom train is such a long time in our cause now there's no room down the phone, it's all you get.
Well, today is the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, and a new exhibition charting the history of the US civil rights movement has been launched in Newcastle. Journey to Justice explores the history of the movement in America and looks at how it's affected attitudes and events here in the UK.
Racism is still the colored man's burden and the white man's shame.
Martin Luther King addressing Newcastle University in 1967.
My name's Carrie Supple, and Journey to Justice is a national alliance of individuals and organisations who are concerned about all sorts of issues to do with social injustice.
The reasons that it's happening in Newcastle is because there are such strong links between Newcastle and the civil rights movement.
So that's your brief overview of Journey to Justice, and I'm now going to hand over to Abby to talk about our latest project. Thanks, Abby, for the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you. Yeah, so my name's Abby. I'm the Economic Injustice Project Coordinator, and you can see our website here. So the Economic Injustice Project came out of the Civil Rights Exhibition, which you've just had a taste of from Carrie. And it really explores why the gap between rich and poor is so extreme in the UK. and offers explanations and possible solutions in a free resource that you can see here for use by all ages and across different organisations and groups. So our bespoke website and podcast that you can see, and also suitcase of resources, aim to provide tools that people can draw on in their own efforts to drive change. And amongst the resources available are stories you can see here in this category, such as successful trade union action that was taken at the Craigie Lee Care Home in Gateshead, that was told by Keith Hodgson, a former NUPE employee, and also tactics, such as Rowan McCabe, who is one of our wonderful speakers at the Sunderland launch of the film. He's from Newcastle, and he uses door-to-door poetry to engage with people across the country, writing poems for them on issues that they care about. And also explainers that are focused on economic justice. So we have, for example, Tessa Gray, who is a senior legal advisor at the Hub Drop-In Project in Newcastle, who explores how economic injustice affects refugees and asylum seekers. We've also created a physical suitcase of all of these online resources that you can see here for those who prefer to use physical resources or don't have access to the internet. And it is out of this project that our film on class and education came. It's where it developed. And we think about how both class and education contribute to inequality in the UK. So the film, The Long Shadow of Class, is designed to be used by a wide range of audiences. And as Carrie mentioned, it was launched in October 2020 in London, in Sunderland at Pop Rex, and in Birmingham as well. We have 6 explainers, each experts in their field from very different backgrounds, who discuss unequal opportunities, accent bias, the markers and stigmas of poverty, and the devastating effect of our current economic model. Each also offers ideas aimed at galvanising people to act for economic justice. And the film is available on our website. There are 7 chapters in total. You can have the full film if you want to view it. So I'll just click through, hopefully it'll load. And so you can use any of the chapters in any setting that you want to use them in, and there are little explainers and activities that go with the film. So I'm going to give you a taster of the film now in the trailer that we have. So I will full screen and enjoy the trailer.
An economically just society is one in which everyone has the economic foundation to live a life of dignity, a life that they are able to flourish and strive in, and I suppose crucially strive and flourish in the way they choose or the way they see fit.
My mother was an incredibly talented and skilled woman who, you know, took an amazing skill of being able to sew, yeah, and could have turned it into a business that it wouldn't have mattered if my dad worked or not, but she didn't have the background and the self-esteem and the support to do that. So the thing is that what you don't have when you work in class are options. You don't really have choices, not really.
And the other thing is, you know, growing up, we kind of knew things were unfair, but also felt quite helpless about it. You know, this is just the way the world is, and we've just got to work harder to try and, you know, transcend the class system.
Now, let me give you an example of how extreme the top 1% is. If you were earning the average income, disposable income in the UK, and you saved every single penny of what you earned, now it would take you over 400 years just to get to the top 1%. And if you wanted to, say, accumulate enough wealth to become as wealthy as the richest person in the UK, James Dyson, the man that makes the Hoovers, and increasingly the air dryers, you would have to wait 800,000 years.
You know, when we compare the amount of disposable income that people have now compared to when 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you know, there's been a change, and the change isn't the fault of the people who are working. It's down to our circumstances beyond their control, and understanding how the whole system works and the injustice of it all may empower, may galvanize people to understand, actually, this isn't my failing. It's not, you know, my neighbor's failing. It's a failing of government. It's a failing of society. It's a failing of wealthy and powerful people.
We have to educate people differently, and we have to make education more accessible to everyone, and we have to not punish children for their circumstances. You know, so I suppose I'm saying I think we have to give more to some than others. You know, we have to give some groups, we have to give some individuals and some groups more to make them equal. So that's really important, I feel. You know, okay, so maybe families do have to live in 2-bedroom flats. Maybe they don't, I don't know. But, you know, let's not punish children. Let's accept that they may not have the spaces to do what they need. So maybe we need to provide them with more resources, or maybe we need to, I don't know what we need to give, but we need to give more to some groups to make them equal. And I think we need to improve the sorts of conversations that we have in society. So this would include in educational institutions too, so that we get people to think about class as much as we think about all the other sorts of oppressions.
Maybe the other thing that I would advocate for is including class background in equalities legislation in this country, making your class origin a protected characteristic. At present, that's not the case. And I think that it would have a very powerful symbolic role if we were to do that, in terms of shining a light on issues of class inequality.
The idea of better or acceptable, or what is valued and what isn't valued, is framed by those who have power, framed by those who lead, framed by those who make the decisions, framed by those who make the policies and the practice.
I think the first thing is to just realize that nothing that we have today, you know, none of the benefits that we have today would exist if people in the past hadn't organized for them. And I'm thinking, you know, the weekend, holiday pay, the NHS, universal suffrage, free education, the end of racial segregation, the end of apartheid, the end of slavery, or that particular type of transatlantic slavery, you know, female emancipation within both the voting system, within wider society, wider acceptance of homosexuality, a kind of like clamp down on homophobia. All of these things only exist because people could be bothered in the past to get up and organize, find other like-minded people, become powerful, and raise their voice and try and change society.
Okay, thank you for listening to that section. So as I say, if you want to have a look at the film, please do go onto the website. And now I will hand over to Mark when he comes back, hopefully shortly. He'll be with us. Oh, he is there. Ah, I could just see that. Yeah, lovely. Hi, Mark.
Mark, we're only just seeing the top 5% of your head on the file. There we go. You're muted, I think. Mark, can you come off mute?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now, everyone?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so my name's Mark Hutchinson, and I was the Sheffield coordinator in May and June 2016 when the exhibition came to our city. And I want to share a few of the projects that we did here in Sheffield and what's been their legacy. So with the exhibition, we did a number of events in and around Sheffield to promote and bring communities together. Prior to the exhibition coming to Sheffield, there had been some tension that seemed to be exacerbated onto the national scale between the Roma community and also within the Southeast Asian community. It wasn't helped by certain politicians talking about gang violence and there being trouble on the streets. So one of the projects that we did, working with Football Unites Racism Divides, was to organize a football tournament of friendship. And I clearly remember a fantastic football match between a group of Roma youths, 16 to 18-year-olds, and a group of Eritrean taxi drivers. And the friendship and camaraderie that those people had as they played football, but then at the end of the match, coming together, talking and sharing their experiences of living in Sheffield and realizing there was more that they had in common than divided them and kept them apart. And we have continued to forge links with those communities through the City of Sanctuary and through the local communities to see that the stories that we told the story of Robbie Howells, who in the 19th century played for Sheffield United and was from the Roma community. He went on to play for England as well, scoring 2 goals in the matches that he played. And that provided a source of pride for the young men to know that somebody from a Roma community had gone on to achieve success. So these local stories we continue to tell through organising city centre walks on civil rights, telling stories that had a local emphasis to them. And we felt this was important because many of the people who came on the walk came from the Black communities and white communities. Some of them were elderly, and we felt there was a need to get people out of their homes and sharing with each other, not only to hear the stories that we had, but hearing their stories of being in Britain, living in the communities and sharing the experiences of the activism that they had been involved in. And this also came about through from 2016 to more recent times when we had the COVID crisis that told us that many people felt isolated. There were the high figures of morbidity and mortality amongst ethnic minority communities. But when people came out on the walk, the stories that they shared with us, stories to do with people who had met Paul Robeson. There was a cache of private letters, photographs of Paul Robeson's time in Sheffield that we were able to share with the group. Stories of how in the activism people had worked together, whether through the trade unions, the cooperative movement, community groups, to fight against racism, to form alliances in the 60s and 70s, coming up with names of people whose stories hadn't always been told. So we found out that somebody like Olive Morris had a connection to Sheffield, and it was great to tell her story. And that sense of a national picture where Journey to Justice was able to bring groups together, not only told the story of young people playing football and older people across the community, or those who were able to walk and share their stories and to, through well-being, be able to find a voice and stories that they didn't know. But we also wanted to go into the schools, and we worked with a number of schools in Sheffield, looking at the curriculum from 2016, 2017. And this very much became a live issue, as many of you know, in the summer of 2019, following the shocking death of George Floyd and what was very much had been for many years explosion of a need from the Black Lives Matter campaign to decolonize the curriculum. And we were able to work from the time of the exhibition and the events that we organized with a group of dancers who told a story through dance and storytelling of Ugandan child soldiers. They brought that story to Sheffield. There were monks, there were Sheffield people who told the story from their migration from Uganda, working with a group of schools, sixth form classes, examination classes that began to allow the young people to tell their stories when they were inspired in workshops where dance and storytelling and acting allowed them to use their creativity and imagination. And that work has continued with both the schools. We're working with Sheffield museums to tell more stories from the archives of local people going back to the 18th and 19th centuries who worked with fugitive slaves such as Frederick Douglass, who came to Sheffield, or the Jubilee Fisk singers, or in more recent times, looking at the Asian youth movement and some of the campaigns that were organized here in Sheffield in the 70s and 80s, and working with Migration Matters, who are now up and running in a vibrant organization as part of the festival scene in Sheffield. And this need to see an improvement in the lives of others has seen a real opportunity in schools who want to make a change. And we're very much part of that. And we've seen that this continuing of decolonizing the curriculum has also had an effect in other areas. So in more recent times, we've been involved in the Black History Month work, particularly in the north side of Sheffield, where the young people are often facing more challenges. And we're looking to set up a look after project, working in schools, working with young people to see that many of the stories that we look at of local people are stories that they resonate with. Just recently, for Black History Month, I went into a school doing 5 assemblies across 5 days to 5 year groups, telling the stories of, for example, like Olive Morris, who was a Black British Panther involved in LGBT work, involved in the homeless struggles in London and in Manchester. And when some of the young people found out that she'd lived in Sheffield, I remember 2 young women turning to each other saying, "Bye, she lived just up the road from us. I didn't know that she had anything to do with us." And look of feeling that they could take action to bring about change was something that they very much want to do. So working with teachers to try embed within schools, within local communities through the walking groups, a sense that we can talk with each other, come together and understand that we have common purpose is something which has been tremendous. And that work from Journey to Justice from 2016 to 2019 has continued, so that even in a time when 1 in 3 are in poverty around the nation, young people can see that they have ideas which are rich, that don't have to hold them back and can bring about a real change in their lives. And when I'm able to hand to a young person the jumper worn by Olive Morris, they touch it, they talk about what it means to them, that brings alive the history around them. Or being able to invite from the Kindertransport Sue Person to talk about her experiences in the 1930s, relating it to the situation facing Syrian refugees and other migrants more recent times, and to see a class of young people enthralled by those stories just a few years ago was absolutely magical. So Journey to Justice has made a difference to the lives of young people in our city. And I just want to say thank you very much to have this opportunity of sharing some of those local stories with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nod in the direction of Rick Bowler, who was a founding member of NEREF, who's very actively involved still, but unfortunately couldn't make it this afternoon. We're running a little bit late now, so I'm just going to have to go straight on, and please sit on your hands if you have questions. Hopefully Journey to Justice will send Jenny some links that she can put on our website and encourage all of you to get involved. But the Northeast has obviously had a very organic relationship with the organization. So I'm now pleased to introduce Amanda Bailey. As Matthew said in his presentation, there was a piece in the newspaper a couple of weeks back just highlighting the fact that the Northeast of England has passed London as the area with the highest child poverty in the whole of the United Kingdom. So this is obviously the starting point for her contribution. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you. And again, I'm sharing my screen. And I hope everyone can see that okay.
Yep.
Okay.
You're good.
So, yes, as Gary said, I'm Amanda Bailey. I'm the North East Child Poverty Commission. And if you are interested in looking up a bit more about our work afterwards, we obviously have a website. We also have a couple of social media channels. So please do follow us on there. But we also have a monthly e-newsletter that you can sign up to via our website if you want to find out a bit more about our work. I must warn you that I think my presentation is possibly going to leave you with more questions than answers. I'm also going to be whizzing through quite a lot of information, as this is obviously quite a complex issue, and I've got 15 minutes in which to get through everything. But I thought it would be helpful to start about what we do know about child poverty in the North East. And I needed to emphasise that almost all the figures that I'm going to be using throughout this presentation will refer to what's known as relative child poverty after housing costs. And I think that's important to highlight because we use the after housing cost measure because that takes account for the fact that we have considerably lower housing costs in most parts of the North East than in many other parts of the country. That's something that was alluded to earlier. So what we do know about child poverty in the North East is that, oh, sorry, my bullets aren't working. There we go. Across the whole of the region, 2 in 5 or 38% of children in the North East were living in poverty in 2021. So that's the first year of the pandemic, and that's the first year for which we have, the latest year for which we have information, because there's always a bit of a time lag on child poverty data. It's always around a year out of date. What we also know is that that continued to go up in the North East in that first year of the pandemic, when it actually fell slightly across the rest of the country. So we're seeing that continued trajectory upwards for children in our region. We also know that child poverty is substantially higher for children in families with an under 5. So almost half, or 47% of North East children in families with an under 5 were living in poverty. And that's in the year before the pandemic, because that's the latest available breakdown we have of that figure. And as I've said, there's always a time lag on the data, and there were some collection issues around data during the pandemic the first year. So that's why we don't have that breakdown for that age group beyond 2019-20 at the moment. And as has just been mentioned, both of those rates are now the highest of anywhere in the country, with the North East having overtaken London and having also experienced the country's steepest increases in child poverty since about 2014-15. We know that families with an under 5 are much more likely to be in poverty than those with older children for several reasons. So whilst that second bullet point, that figure is really quite shocking, it's not surprising given the overall really high rates we have for children of all ages now in the North East. So we also know, because all the evidence tells us, that experiencing poverty in early childhood can have really adverse and often lifelong impacts on children's physical health, their mental well-being, their educational outcomes, their future employment prospects, and indeed things like infant mortality rates, healthy life expectancy rates. And it's really important, therefore, that we understand the structural drivers of rising poverty in our region, given the implications of that, not just for individual children and families, which are clearly huge, but also I think for our region as a whole. And so towards the end of September, the North East Child Poverty Commission published a new report. You can see the cover there on the screen, called Getting the Building Blocks Wrong, which sought to explore why child poverty in the North East is now so high and why it's risen so steeply in recent years, and particularly for the region's youngest children. The report's available on our website, but I'll also post a link to it in the chat afterwards. The report contained a chart which looks a little bit like the one that we saw earlier from Matt. And one part of the report we did a lot of it around the quantitative analysis, which we explored the data behind rising child poverty in the North East. We did that with the support of CPAG, the National Charity Child Poverty Action Group, as well as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And from this chart that you can see, that's taken directly from our report, you can see the pattern of child poverty in the North East compared to the national average. And as you can see, over the past 25 years, this chart starts at 96, 97. Child poverty in the North East has almost always been higher in our region than in the UK on average. But what you should also be able to see is that it did actually fall markedly in our region between about 99, 2000 and 2013, 14. And actually, if I get my little pointer, you can see that by this point, it actually fell below the UK wide rate by the end of that period. So we saw this sort of sustained fall to the point where it actually fell below the national average. And that demonstrates, I think, it's one of our key beliefs at the North East Child Poverty Commission, that child poverty in the North East is not inevitable. You can actually bring it down if you try to do so. What you can also see from that chart is that the sustained rise in child poverty that took place across the North East from 2014-15 onwards until the year before the pandemic, so here, was far more drastic than the rise that we saw across the whole of the UK. But also that rate has continued to rise in the first year of the pandemic. As I said, it fell slightly across the rest of the country. But as a result of that continued rise, you can see that the gap between the North East average and the UK average is actually now as large as it has ever been. So despite all the sort of rhetoric and commitments we've heard around levelling up, that gap is now as large as it's ever been. And actually the North East has gone from having a child poverty rate here that was below the UK average to having the highest rate of any UK nation or region in the space of just 7 years. This chart is also taken from our report, and that shows the poverty rate for children in households with a child under 5, both across the UK and the North East, over almost the same time period. And it also shows that the fall that took place in child poverty for children in those families and the subsequent rise was even greater than for children overall. So you can see from here, from 1999 to 2000, down to 2013-14, actually the poverty rate for children in those families halved from being 49% to 25%. So that's a far greater fall than that took place across the UK as a whole. And again, that demonstrates that child poverty isn't inevitable even for our youngest children. And again, the subsequent really steep increase we've seen for children in those families in the region means that the gap between the UK average and the North East average has reached a 25-year high. And this again shows you just how quickly progress on reducing child poverty can be lost. And what you can really see, and I think this chart shows, is that the really dramatic reduction in poverty rates that took place for the North East youngest children during the 2000s and early 2010s has actually been almost entirely reversed in less than half the time it took to achieve it. So in terms of what has driven the steep increases in child poverty in the North East, particularly for our youngest children, that's what we wanted to explore with our report because we feel it's so important to understand that. Having trawled through all the sort of underlying data with CPAG and again with some support from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we identified a combination of economic trends and demographic factors which have helped to explain this. These include, for example, the North East experiencing a much steeper increase in in-work child poverty than across the UK. So at a time when median household earnings were rising across the UK, they actually were falling in the North East. And that means that we haven't seen a rise in household earnings that have mitigated against the cuts to the value of social security that have taken place over the last decade. The other issue we have in the North East is that we haven't really seen the fall in out of work child poverty that's been observed across the UK. So that's been falling in quite a sustained way across the rest of the country, and it's stayed pretty much constant in the North East. And that might be explained by what's known as the economic activity rate staying fairly constant in the region. We also have seen a larger rise in the proportion of families who are much less likely to be in a position to work or who may find it harder to work without the right support in place. And that includes children in families where someone has a disability. We have seen a steeper increase in that. And interestingly, we've seen an increase in the number of families with an under 5 when there's been a slight fall in that number over the last few years. We also identified a number of other potential drivers of the steep increase in the North East. That includes the North East not seeing an increase in the share of children in households with an under 5 with parents or carers in work. Again, that's been quite a sustained increase across the UK, but that has remained fairly static in the North East. We also, and this comes on to the subject of what we're talking about today, or it relates to it, we also have seen the North East has the highest proportion of children, or higher than the UK average, in a number of groups of families who are much more likely to be in poverty. So, for example, that includes families where someone has a disability. Alongside Wales, we actually have the highest proportion of children living in families where someone has a disability, but we've also seen a steeper increase in that than other parts of the country, or the country as a whole. We have the highest proportion of children living in families where it's a lone parent family. So 28% of children in the North East live in a lone parent family, compared to the national average of 22%, and for obvious reasons, they're much more likely to be in poverty. We also have a higher proportion of families with parents aged under 25, who again are much more likely to be in poverty, partly because if they're in work, they're much more likely to be in low paid, insecure or precarious work, but they also are entitled to receive a lower rate of universal credit if you're under age 25, and of course a lower national minimum wage if you're aged under 23. And interestingly, we also have, outside London, the highest proportion of children living in families in rented accommodation. And we've seen the steepest increase in the share of children living in rented accommodation in recent years. And that's both can be a driver and a symptom of rising child poverty. And that's something I hadn't picked up really until we did that report, the fact that outside London, we have the highest proportion of children living in rented accommodation. But and this is a really big but, given the topic of today's discussion. What we don't have in that list quite clearly is children from Black, Asian and minority ethnic or global majority families, for whom we know there's a much greater risk of being in poverty, but they're not on that list for the North East. So what do we know about the prevalence of poverty for children from Black, Asian and minority ethnic families? As was mentioned before, we do have information on this at a national level, but because of data collection issues during the first year of the pandemic, and as I said, child poverty figures are always at least 1 year out of date. I think the latest breakdown we have of this is from the year before the pandemic for 2019-20, and this is taken from CPAG, who say that 46% of children from Black, Asian and minority ethnic families are in poverty, compared to 26% of children in white British families. But importantly, that's 26% of children in white British families across the whole of the UK. We also know, as was mentioned before, that the likelihood of being in poverty is much higher, or particularly high, for children from certain groups. So again, from CPAG, they suggest that 60% of children from families of Bangladeshi background are in poverty, 54% Pakistani, and 47% of what is, as we've heard, a really large, broad grouping, which actually is, there's a lot of diversity within it, but 47% from that grouping of Black, African, Caribbean or Black British. And what do we know about the nature and extent of ethnic minority child poverty in the North East? And Matt's mentioned this before, but actually frustratingly, and I would say unacceptably, actually little. Colleagues may be aware of the report that was published back in December last year, actually almost a year ago today, which sought to look at the really broad range of inequalities that impact children across all three northern regions, so not just the North East, but the North West and Yorkshire and Humber. And it identified this as being an issue that living in the North is significantly associated with child poverty, but belonging to a minority ethnic group is also powerfully associated with child poverty. There is an urgent need to consider the intersections of child poverty and ethnicity, as well as other aspects of identity, such as gender, disability and age. But the reality is that at the moment, there is a real dearth of robust data on this for the North East, both at a regional level and a local level. As Matt mentioned before, there isn't really any regional breakdowns of poverty by ethnicity, and there certainly isn't at a local level, which is obviously incredibly frustrating. particularly for people who are making policies or spending decisions or trying to target work within local areas. And one of the reasons for this, particularly impacting the North East and the lack of robust data, is because, as has been mentioned numerous times before, and this is obviously based on the data that we do have from the census, although Gary mentioned that there may well be significant underreporting, but the North East has always been the least ethnically diverse region, which makes it difficult to extrapolate information from a national to a regional, never mind local level. But as has also been mentioned, today's event is really timely because we finally had the publication of the new ethnicity data from the 2021 census on Tuesday. And whilst obviously that only represents a snapshot in time, as in the date that the census was taken in March last year, what we can see from that is that the North East does remain the least ethnically diverse region. And pulling out the figures as I did very quickly yesterday, and I've not had much chance to go through them all in great detail, but 90.6% at the last census of the region's population described themselves as what is now on the census described as white, English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish or British, which is down from 93.6% on the census before 10 years earlier. That compares with 74.4% across England and Wales, compared with 80.5% again a decade earlier in 2011. And so you can see from those two bullets that not only is the North East the least diverse region, and it remains as such, but actually the pace of change here has also been much slower than across the country as a whole, so that the reduction in the sort of white British population has been slower in the North East, starting from a lower standing point too. But, and again, this is a really big but, the picture is very different in different parts of our region. So, sorry, just put that bullet point in there. What we can see from the Census 21 data that was published on Tuesday is that two parts or local authority areas of our region stand out as being by far and away the most diverse in terms of ethnicity. So looking at the percentage of the population who identify as white British, which I'm using as from now on as shorthand for the longer white English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish or British category, you can see that Newcastle, that now is 74.5% of the borough of Newcastle, and 79.5% for Middlesbrough. So those two are by far and away the most ethnically diverse parts of the region. But if we look at other local authorities in the North East, we can see they are considerably less diverse, with 7 local authority areas having a population of between 90 and 94% identifying as white British on the 2021 census. And actually 3 out of our 12 local authority areas have white British populations of between 94 and 96.5%, and that's Redcar and Cleveland at the top end there. So you can see there's quite big variation within the region, and that chimes with what Matt was saying about perhaps cities being much more likely to be ethnically diverse than other parts of the country, and that's certainly the case in our region too. So in terms of us not having any kind of regional or local breakdowns of child poverty by ethnicity, what we do obviously have is child poverty rates by local authority, and we also have ethnicity rates by local authority, and we can perhaps look at both of those together in terms of trying to observe where there may be patterns, and if we look at the 2 North East local authority areas with the highest child poverty rates, you can see that the 2 North East local authority areas with the highest rates are Newcastle and Middlesbrough. So Newcastle, with both, you can see have child poverty rates of over 40%, and that compares with a national rate of 27. That's not to suggest that there is obviously a definitive link between the two things, but it is, as I said, a fact that the 2 areas which are by far the most diverse ethnically are also the places that the highest child poverty rates in the region. And in fact, in both Newcastle and Middlesbrough are the only 2 local authority areas in the North East, which are in the top 10 places across the whole of the UK with the highest child poverty rates. And they sit alongside 8 other local authority areas, which you can see from that list there are also very ethnically diverse. We can also use the new census data, which the ONS have very helpfully produced these interactive maps that you can dig out on their website to dig into and look into what we do know about a bit further. And as you can see from this map, this covers the Newcastle local authority area. So that's the bit covered by the black line there. And obviously Newcastle stretches from the villages in the north to the border with Northumberland in the west, down to the River Tyne here. And you can see from that whilst the whole population of Newcastle has a population that identifies as white British of 74.5%, they very kindly, helpfully broken that down by the different areas of the city. And you can see that the darker areas are where you have higher rates of people identifying as white British, and the lighter green where there are lower rates. And you can see from that there are particular areas that jump out of that map. So for example, here, this very light green area is what's described by the ONS as Elswick North. That has a white British population of just 26.3%. Elswick South, just here, is a bit higher at 41%. But what we do know is that the whole ward of Elswick, the child poverty rate is a staggering 60.8%. So that's way, way higher than the city average of 42.4%, and much more than in fact, twice the national average of 27%. So it is clear that one of the wards with the very highest rates of child poverty in the city is also the most ethnically diverse. And again, we can look here just a little bit next door, called Arthur's Hill, where that has a white population of 48%, just under half, again has a very high child poverty rate of over 53%. And again, I need to emphasise that I've only been looking at this data for the last couple of days, and I need to do some more work around this. And it's not always clear that the areas used by the ONS completely match up with ward levels, local authority wards, which is what we have for child poverty data, but it's useful to be able to look at that and overlay the two things. And again, you can do the same for Middlesbrough. So you can see that Middlesbrough Central Ward, so that's that bit here, has a 38.9% white British population and a child poverty rate of 64%. So that's one of the highest in the whole of the region. Nearby, we have Newport Ward, which are here, again, one of the areas with much more ethnically diverse, and that has a child poverty rate of 67%, again, one of the highest in the whole of the country. And then to finish, and I'm going to say but, and another really big but, the picture for our region is a really complex one, because it's not easy to try and make simple correlations where you map ethnicity rates against those areas we know of higher child poverty rates in our region. So, we do know that Middlesbrough and Newcastle both are by far the most ethnically diverse parts of the region. They have the highest child poverty rates. But despite still being the least ethnically diverse region, the North East does now have the highest child poverty rate in the UK. And one of the reasons for that is because we have a high rate in every part of the North East. And you can see from this chart, which is taken directly from the report I was talking about before, but this is the UK average from 2014-15 to 2020-21. And then every one of the North East local authority areas, you can see that every part of the North East now has a child poverty rate that is some way above the national average. And that's why the North East, or part of the reason why the North East overall has such a high rate. And what you can also see is that applies to areas that have more ethnically diverse populations, but it also applies to those areas that really don't. So Redcar and Cleveland, which is the least ethnically diverse part of the region, actually has the fourth highest rate of child poverty. And again, Hartlepool is here, and that was one of the least ethnically diverse places. And in fact, Sunderland, Redcar and Cleveland, South Tyneside and Hartlepool all now sit in the top 20 local authorities in the whole of the country with the highest child poverty rates. alongside Newcastle and Middlesbrough, which are in the top 10. So I realise that's been something of a gallop between a very large amount of data and information, and as I said, it's probably thrown up more questions than answers, but I hope it's been helpful in at least shedding some light on what we do and don't know about the links between ethnic populations and child poverty in the region. There's clearly a lot more work to be done on this, and it's helpful now that we do have this data from the census, but the lack of information and data is highly problematic, and how we get around that is obviously going to be an ongoing challenge. Thank you.
You're on mute, Gary. You're on mute.
Be with you. Right. I was just going to say I do actually have a degree in mathematics, but the numbers were coming at me thick and fast. We're not going to have time for questions because I don't want to squeeze Joe too much. We can run over slightly. The only thing I would say is that I would urge caution in thinking that because poverty and ethnicity or ethnic diversity are both concentrated in the urban areas, there are very serious, slightly different issues in rural areas. I've spent many years working in rural Northumberland, rural Durham and rural North Yorkshire. And to be a Black and minority ethnic person in rural areas is every bit as oppressive, if in a slightly different way, as it is living in urban areas. So let's not forget the rural areas too. Right, Joe, straight over to you. And I'm sorry you've had to wait.
No, so thanks a lot, Gary. And thanks again for having me as well, albeit I'm in the unenviable position of having to follow all the great speakers in a graveyard shift when everyone is probably in a state of graph and chart fatigue. So I'll try and keep the energy high where possible and keep it as interesting as I possibly can. So hopefully you can all see the screen which I'm sharing. I'm just going to put it onto the slideshow format. So as you can see from my lovely holding slide, I'm here to talk about the real living wage, both in its kind of broader descriptive context and of course how it relates to certain ethnic minority workers. So as you can see, currently, as calculated by the Resolution Foundation, the living wage is £10.90 across the UK, but £11.95 in London to reflect those higher living costs. So just before I go too much into the kind of more descriptive or analytical parts, I just want to kind of point on clarity, just to kind of basically give you a quick description of what we mean when we say the real living wage. Because not helpfully, we're kind of having to constantly doing this point of clarification as a result of, in 2016, George Osborne basically stole our branding and called the minimum wage the national living wage, which meant that we had to rebrand as the real living wage. So the key difference between the two is currently the national living wage is £9.50, whereas ours is £10.90, and as I say, £11.95 in London. Of course, the national living wage will go up to £10.42 as of April next year. But conceptually, the key difference is that, I mean, the national living wage is the statutory minimum. It applies to those aged 23 and older, and it has no mandate to meet living costs, but rather has a mandate to get to 66% of median earnings by 2024, and there's no regional variance, so there's no higher rate for to account for higher living costs in London. In the contrary, so ours is voluntary, so it's paid by almost 12,000 businesses throughout the UK, so 1 in 10 workers now works for a living wage employer. It applies to those aged 18 and older, so there's no real age limit as long as you're an adult worker, and it's calculated every year based on the actual cost of living. So given that we're kind of currently going through a cost of living crisis, with inflation kind of being above 10% for the past 6 months, obviously that's quite relevant, and it's based on a basket of household goods and services. So the idea is that if you're earning this wage and you're working full time, that you'll be able to meet those essential living costs. So not just your basics like, you know, your food, utilities, roof over your head and that kind of thing, but also kind of being able to pay for school uniform or replace a white good and have a savings buffer. So that's the key conceptual difference that I just wanted to quickly get across. But now I'll just go on to kind of how many people are paid less than the living wage, so in proportional and absolute terms. So I guess one of the kind of key things to get across is that in 2022, both the percentage and the number of workers paid less than the living wage both fell to record lows. So if you just focus to the kind of far right-hand side of the chart, you'll see of all the bars and parts of the line which are not faded out, both have gone down to record lows since the figures were collected, basically. So it fell to 3.5 million workers as of April 2022 were paid less than the living wage, and that's 12.2% of all jobs in total, which is low by historical standards. So there are a couple of kind of key drivers of this, some of which are kind of grouped into the direct drivers, and then some which drive it into the, collected into the indirect drivers. So on the direct side, we saw a sharp increase to the national living wage as of April 2022 to £9.50, which obviously has a ripple effect up the income distribution and therefore pushes more people above our rate, which is a positive thing. And similarly, we've also seen real growth in our network of accredited living wage employers. And as I've mentioned, 1 in 10 employers throughout the UK now work for a living wage accredited employer, which is really positive as well. In terms of the indirect drivers, so what we've seen is a kind of historically tight labour market with firms really struggling to recruit for vacancies, and basically more workers than there is, more jobs available than there are workers. And that also matched with the historically high levels of inflation that we've seen has also driven up wages, although they are behind inflation, that has still driven up some wages above our rate. However, looking at the current projections to wage growth, so currently the Bank of England project that wage growth will average around 5.75% over the next 12 months. The Treasury is slightly more optimistic. They project around 5.9%, but given that inflation, as I say, is in the double digits, that's still going to lag far behind. So according to our forecast, which uses those current wage growth projections, the number of jobs paid less than the living wage as of next year will be 5.1 million, and that will be 18.5% as a percentage, with wages lagging behind inflation. So it's very much projected to be the sort of blip before the storm that we see, as I say. And we have a similar issue as we do with the child poverty data, with a lot of the data being slightly retrospective. So we have to bear that in mind as well. So how does this impact certain ethnic minority workers? Well, we did a bit of research on this in September 2022. And what we found is that certain ethnic minority groups are more likely to be paid less than the living wage than others. And as you'd expect, it is those ethnic groups with typically lower levels of pay in general, such as, for example, Bangladeshi workers and Pakistani workers, similar with Black African, Black Caribbean workers, that are more likely to pay less than the living wage, while the opposite is true for those kind of more higher paid ethnic groups like white, Indian and Chinese workers. So, I mean, effectively, that's kind of quite a common sense view, but it would also suggest that kind of earning less than the living wage is quite a good proxy for the kind of broader labour market data that you might see from the ONS. So, I mean, obviously, it's not just ethnicity which impacts someone's vulnerability to earning less than the living wage. So, I mean, as you can imagine, the increased risks that certain ethnic minority workers face can also be compounded with, for example, being a young worker, being female, or being born outside the UK, aka being a migrant. And that typically tends to sort of give a degree of double jeopardy when it comes to being low paid. So the graph that I've just brought to this slide breaks this down just by gender. And as you can see, pretty much across every single ethnic group we've got data for, women are more likely to be paid less than the living wage than men. And normally it's by at least sort of 3 to 4 percentage points, which is, you know, quite a sizable amount. The only outlier here is the Bangladeshi group, in which men, 36% of male workers earn less than the living wage compared to 31% of female. But I mean, both are quite uniquely high in that respect. And that's also consistent with the broader wage data, with, again, Bangladeshi men being slightly lower paid than Bangladeshi women. But I mean, that is quite the quirk amongst kind of the broader trend seen across gender and ethnicity. So, I mean, how does this kind of impact hours as well? I think is also an important question, because pay is not the only thing which describes the sort of constitution of good work. So too do stable and secure hours. We've done a bit of research on this quite recently. So this data came out a couple of weeks ago. And what we wanted to do was basically interrogate the degree to which ethnic minority workers face sort of volatile and insecure shifts, and how that compares to white workers. And what we found is that effectively across all of the kind of stable and secure working hours metrics that we have, that ethnic minority workers were more likely to kind of fall underneath those thresholds. So for example, they were more likely to face short notice for shifts, with 45% of ethnic minority workers having less than a week's notice for shifts, compared to 28% of white workers. They were also more likely to see shifts cancelled unexpectedly, which can obviously wreak havoc on people's finances. So for example, if you think that you've got a shift coming next week and you've budgeted for that, and then that shift is cancelled, which isn't paid properly, you're then really going to struggle to kind of be able to meet essential living costs. And this is something which impacts those workers disproportionately. So 38% of minority ethnic workers have had shifts cancelled unexpectedly over the past 12 months. And that's around 14 percentage points higher than for white workers, which is around 24%. Now, as a result, what we find is that these workers are typically more likely to face something we call the insecurity premium. So if we look at the implications of having shifts cancelled and also being called into work on short notice, for example, like if you get called into work and you have a couple of hours to get there, you may have to source emergency childcare. You may also have to source emergency transport to get to work in the first place. And that also comes at higher costs. So what that means is almost like the insecurity premium can augment the poverty premium, which I think people are more aware of. And what we found is that once more, this is disproportionately impacting those ethnic minority workers. So for example, 37% of ethnic minority workers have had to pay higher travel costs compared to 26% of white workers. And when it comes to higher childcare costs, 24% of ethnic minority workers have had to pay higher compared to 16% of white workers. So looking at the kind of the composition effect here, we find there's kind of two key drivers. So firstly, we found that ethnic minority workers are more likely to be in shift work altogether, but also that even when you controlled for just looking at shift workers, that they were still more likely than white workers to kind of fall underneath the living hours thresholds, i.e. having short shift notice periods or seeing shifts cancelled. So it's a trend of not just composition, but also of behavior and treatment as well. So in terms of what drives these gaps, and there's a lot of text on here, and I know we're kind of running short on time, so I will just have to kind of whiz through a lot of it. But in terms of the report that we did, what we found is that there was a high degree of racial discrimination at work. So we ran a survey of more than 2,000 ethnic minority workers, and we found that actually the majority had experienced some level of discrimination at work, and this had a significant impact on the levels of pay and progression in the labour market. So this includes around a third who have been passed for promotion and over a quarter who have been refused a job as a result of their ethnicity. A second key factor was educational qualifications, and there is a kind of correlational relationship here between, the higher attaining ethnic groups tend to have higher earnings, and the reverse is true for the lower attaining group. But there's a whole load of anomalies here. For example, with Bangladeshi workers, Bangladeshi students tend to outperform white students at school, and yet that doesn't manifest in the labour market. And we also find that, for example, free school meal eligible students are the lowest performing educational group across the ethnic the ethnic gradient, and so it would suggest that social class as well as race certainly plays a role. And I think that came up on one of the previous presentations as well. We also find a high degree of occupation and sectoral clustering, which has a huge impact on the ability for certain ethnic minority groups to earn above the living wage. So there's a strong degree of sectoral clustering, for example, for Bangladeshi men in the catering related service and businesses, which again are typically low paid, while similarly black workers are overrepresented in the care sector, which is also quite a low paid industry. And finally, we find a high clustering of underemployment and part-time work among specific low-paid ethnic groups, such as Pakistani and Bangladeshi workers, who are much more likely to be in part-time roles than the national average, which is typically much lower paid than full-time roles. So in terms of what some of the solutions might be, and these were what we kind of brought up in the report, and just to say, obviously the kind of solutions to this problem go way beyond kind of the things that I'm going to raise now. And obviously when we talk about the sort of ethnic cleavages in the labour market, we talk about both the sort of glass ceiling and the sticky floor. And given the sort of focus of our organisation, we do tend to focus on the kind of those that are at the bottom end of the income distribution. So obviously being a living wage employer can really help in terms of rectifying that the kind of discrepancies at the lower end of the labour market. So we know that, for example, the minimum wage has had a disproportionate benefit to ethnic minority workers because they're more likely to be on the minimum wage in the first place. So obviously every time that's raised, that has a disproportionate benefit. And we see a similar impact with regards to the actual the real living wage as well. And similarly, we've also developed an adjacent accreditation scheme called Living Hours. And once again, this applies to all employees aged 18 and above. And that mandates that employers provide decent notice for shift, so 4 weeks or more, with guaranteed payment if that shift is cancelled, and the right to a contract which reflects actual hours worked. And obviously, given that certain ethnic minority groups are much more likely to fall short of that threshold, the more employers can provide that as a guarantor for all the employees, the better, and the more that will have an impact with regards to redressing racial inequalities in the labour market. So I will close there because I know there's been a lot of information, and just say thank you. And as I say, I'm more than happy to send these slides across to Gary and to Jenny and the wider team. And yeah, just thanks all so much for having me as well. Cheers.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through that as a gallop. When I was first politically and economically active those 200 or 300 years ago, feels like the explanation for low income was always that people weren't working. And I think Joe has given us more than enough ammunition to be able to look somebody in the face when they say to us, if only these scoundrels would get a job, they'd be all right. But clearly they wouldn't be all right. And in many cases, they'd be worse off than they would be on benefits. Of course, the old mantra, but here it's because of the appalling conditions that many people face in terms of their working conditions and particularly their wages. So I put a fairly long part of what was going to be my closing remark on the chat. So just check that out while we're winding up. I know it's now 4 o'clock. I'm happy to take 1 or 2 questions, but obviously they're going to have to be fairly short. And if you have questions, please say who they're for. So I'll open the door for questions quickly. And don't forget, a lot of this stuff will be on the web later on. I have a feeling people are absolutely groggy from the the data. It's been an incredibly informative session, one of the best I think we've had for some time. So I'm not surprised if people feel both a bit groggy, and as I said in my chat, I know people have other commitments. So one last call. Any further questions, points for clarification?
Gary, just to say, would it be possible to have the presentations shared with those attending?
Yeah, I thought I just said that, but we have asked all the presenters to let us have the slides. They'll go on our website. And the other thing I wanted to emphasize, just in closing then, is we're always on the lookout for key issues. This one began to appear on our horizon a few months ago. It's obviously turned out to be an incredibly important one, and there's a lot there for people to follow up. But if you have ideas for other webinars which involve this mix of 2, 3, 4 speakers, questions, different kinds of aspects of a particular issue around the general area of race and ethnicity, please let me know or let Jenny know, and we'll do our best to organise them, particularly if you've got ideas for speakers. So I am going to stop there, and I'm going to say thank you very much for hanging on in there to the end. Thank you for your attendance, and watch out for our next big show. You can't complain that NEREF doesn't give you everything. We give you television, we give you film, we give you live speakers, we give you the web. So there you are, multimedia and all. Thank you very much.
Gary, sorry, before you go, can you just confirm the recording? It's being recorded, isn't it?
It has
session.
been. Yeah.
And that'll be available to everybody, yeah?
Well, I hope so. Yes. It wouldn't be much point otherwise.
Okay. Yeah, well, this is
Not
what
our secret MI5.
I was going to go and see me solicitor, so I won't bother.
I'll download everything. It'll be uploaded on the website, and I'll send everybody the link. And feel free to disseminate it because it'll be on a public website. But I'll check it with the speakers first to make sure that they're happy with the with how it looks.
Yeah, and that underlines my last task, which I'm happy to perform, which is Jenny will be working through the night, of course, and all this stuff will be available at 8 o'clock in the morning when you come into work. But seriously, just to thank her for all the incredibly hard work she does. She makes my job very, very easy, and she really is the force behind a lot of these webinars ending up the way they do in a very successful way. So thank you very much. If you want to wave your hands, clap, whatever, thank you. So good night and safe journey to everybody.
Thanks very much.